My name is...
Listen, I know that many people at this point might sigh when they hear another horror channel mention H.P. Lovecraft, because it's been explored in every way imaginable and has become kind of a meme. But please bear with me as I employ his writing as a starting point and as a simile in today's video. Among all of Lovecraft's memorable stories, there is one that has always stuck with me and that is often overlooked: the music of Erich Zann. Before rereading it, I thought that my fondness for the short piece might have had to do with it being one of my first Lovecraft readings. A very specific and different entry point into the crooked and dreadful world of the author. I would assume that most start from more well-known and well-liked tales like At the Mountains of Madness, The Color Out of Space, The Shadow over Innsmouth, or The Dunwich Horror, all of which give a pretty good taste of what Lovecraft's imagery and themes are like. The music of Erich Zann stands apart in this regard. It feels, at least to me, as one of his more transitional stories, so to say, of a period where his prose hadn't fully come into its own and where Poe's influence was still very palpable. It does have its cosmic, incomprehensible, and oh so terrifying ghastly presences, but the scale of it feels smaller when compared to his future works. It feels more like drawing back for a moment the curtains of a small window and glimpsing at something much more vast and more horrifying moving towards you.
Foreshadowing.
It is also special for its subject. Lovecraft's horror is usually more identified with its conceptual or visual content, where he'll write that something is incomprehensible and then proceed to render it in great detail. And while he doesn't shy away from sound descriptions, the obvious being the Ancient One's unspeakable language, or whispers and rats scurrying inside walls and such, I think this is the only time he focuses on music. It's doubly interesting because the man himself wasn't really into music, so this seems like an odd choice of subject, but it makes perfect sense. In his effort to put the unimaginable to page, he touched on many of our sensory and intellectual limitations. A color outside our perception, an unspeakable language, non-Euclidean spaces, sights so horrifying and vast in scale that they break the viewer's mind, etc., etc. So it seems to make total sense to bring music in this equation, it being full of mysterious and compelling forces that to this day we can't fully rationalize. The ineffable pure will, if we want to Schopenhauer this up. So, what's the story actually about? In short, it's the account written by a metaphysics student of his time living in a very steep street built on a hill and surrounded by old crooked buildings. He gets the apartment right under Erich Zann, an old mute German viola player. During the night he starts overhearing the old man's playing, and it's like nothing he's ever heard before. He can't make sense of it. He seems to be playing notes that don't even exist. It's horrifying but incredibly alluring too. The student describes Zann as a genius. He goes to meet the man, who seems frightened and angry at first, but when he explains that he just wishes to hear him play, Zann seems to calm down and lets him in. He plays his viola for about an hour and his playing is amazing, although the student can't help but notice that he's not playing the pieces that he overhears at night. When he starts to whistle the notes to explain which ones he means, Zann suddenly becomes terrified and shuts the protagonist's mouth with his hand. The old man then scribbles a note in which he apologizes and says he suffers from paranoia and other health problems because of his age. He tells the student that he's welcome to come and listen again, but not to ask for his other pieces. He also asks him to move down a floor so he won't hear him anymore, saying he'll pay for the difference in rent. Our protagonist accepts, feeling pity for the old guy. From that moment on, though, whenever he goes to Zann, the man seems less and less inclined to welcome him, until he starts outright evading him and stops accepting his visits. Like all of Lovecraft's obsessive characters, the student can't let this go and starts secretly going up to Zann's apartment and listening to his playing through the door. One night he suddenly hears a terrified cry and fears for the old man's safety, so he begins to bang on the door. He hears Zann getting up from the floor and closing the shutters of his window. When the old man finally opens the door, he seems relieved at the student's presence. He sits him down in a chair and scribbles a note in which he asks him to wait there while he prepared his full account in German of all the marvels and terrors which beset him. After an hour, though, he is interrupted by a distant and low note coming from beyond the curtained window. In an instant, Zann grabs his viola and starts playing furiously, producing a maddening and unearthly cacophony. The window shatters and the pages he'd been writing fly out. The student tries to grab them, and as he gets close to the window, he looks out, expecting to see the city lights burning. What he sees instead is
Only the blackness of space illimitable. Unimagined space alive with motion and music and having no semblance to anything on Earth.
the candles blow out and he is left in darkness. Staggering along the room, he feels unseen things brush against him. When he tries to scream, he cannot hear himself above the horrid viola. He begins to shake the old man, but realizes that he's ice cold and unbreathing. On the brink of insanity, the student flees from the apartment and staggers frantically to the city, where he finally seems to regain control of his faculties. When he tries to make his way back, the building and the whole street seem to have disappeared, vanishing from any map, forgotten to anyone but him. The story is fascinating for a few different reasons. We don't know what lay beyond that window. We don't know if Zann was keeping something at bay or calling it through his music. We don't know what happened to the street and the old man, and if any of it was even real or just a dream concocted by the student's mind. Lovecraft himself considered it one of his best works because of its ambiguities. Most importantly, and this is the main reason for which the story has stuck with me for so long, we don't know what Erich Zann's music sounded like. Years after first reading the short tale, when it was buried in the back of my mind, I had finally found a piece of music which immediately brought it back. It was Luciano Cilio's Dialoghi del presente, especially the opening track, Primo quadro della conoscenza. So there it is. If you want to, you can go and listen to it on YouTube right now, so you'll see I'm not pulling your leg. But you should do it in a specific condition, completely alone, with decent headphones, preferably at night or in the evening, and you must listen to the full track. But I do suggest that you listen to it after this video, actually, because I will give you some context that might make you appreciate it even more. Who was Luciano Cilio? He was a Neapolitan composer born in 1950. Not much is known about his short life, except the fact that his journey started in architecture and theater stage design. This would greatly affect his writing process, seeing as he seemed to always have a need to tie his music to something visual. In fact, Cilio was a self-taught musician and composer, and he would not write normal sheet music. His notes looked like this. He would use colors, shapes, and abstract visual cues to put his music to page. From this alone, we can figure out that Cilio was a little bit different, a little bit out there. And Italy in the 70s, especially the South, wasn't exactly the most welcoming when it comes to different people. Hell, not much changed since then. If you want to get the gist of Naples' condition after the war, I strongly suggest that you try and find the early stories of Anna Maria Ortese, another sensitive soul who suffered because of her otherness in that city. What was so different about Cilio's music? For one, it was difficult to define, because it would go under the vague classification of avant-garde or experimental music, which doesn't really tell us anything, except that it's quirky. It was a strange and unique mixture of minimalism, classical, jazz, and oriental elements which ended up sounding like nothing else. In the few written publications concerning Cilio, we find mentioned the names of possible influences like Schoenberg, Scriabin, Mahler, Chopin, Sorrenti, Sean Phillips, Arvo Pärt, and many more. Now, obviously, it's not like Italian composers, critics, and academics didn't know experimental music or were in some way against it. But when we're talking about a young, self-taught composer who is also polemic against Neapolitan institutions, it doesn't fly very well. You see, Cilio's approach to the avant-garde was different from most composers of the time. What the avant-garde often tries to do in all types of art is break the rules, break away from tradition, make something completely new and unheard, not caring that much about the experience of the public, but acting in the name of the art itself. Cilio had something else in mind. He wished to make something new, but without leaving history behind. He wanted to make music that was evocative, that could transport the listener into another dimension, instead of experimenting for experimentation's sake.
Il rischio da parte dei musicisti è quello di impegnarsi a capofitto nella ricerca senza una coscienza storica. A questo punto la ricerca diventa gratuita, pretestuosa. È un'avanguardia accademica, di maniera che non svolge alcun ruolo storico ed è origine di confusioni e ambiguità.
So, it's actually quite ironic. He was too strange for the general public, but he also did not fit with the academic type of experimentation. Because of this, he would end up becoming an idol, a lonesome and unheard voice with no audience, ignored by the laymen and derided by institutions. To pour a little salt into the wound, young composers and musicians started to come to him asking for guidance and advice, because he would always make himself available. But his name still wasn't spread officially, because he wasn't a real maestro, but just a dilettante. And this absence of title, which to us might seem banal, would pain Cilio very much, according to those who knew him. It only served to reinforce his status as an outsider. Speaking of the people who were close to him, the musicians, the artists, they seemed the only ones that believed in him. His main pianist, Eugenio Fels, would actually play some of his pieces during his own performances, along with classic and very well-known composers. And in the right context, the public would react very positively. We also have to mention Girolamo de Simone, who is pretty much almost single-handedly keeping the memory of Cilio alive, posting transcriptions of his pieces and playing them on the piano himself on YouTube, pushing for the pressing of new and more complete LPs featuring unreleased tapes and compositions, thus saving them from becoming lost media. Do you remember when I told you about Cilio's peculiar way of writing sheet music? Yeah, what that did is pretty much make it impossible for anyone who didn't originally play his compositions to do so, because they would be impossible to read. So it's thanks to people like De Simone and Fels if the younger generation can now play those pieces, and that we can, just in general, still listen to Cilio's music. That's really just. I also wanted to mention Fabio Donato, the photographer responsible for all these pictures of Cilio. Thanks to him, we can actually look in Cilio's eyes, connect with him on a different level, understand something more about the man. Now, about the album. Cilio played guitar, mandolin, bass, and flute. He would also later learn the sitar. Other than that, he was also directly involved in the mixing of the LP, which is part of what gives it its unique sound. The music itself is, well, hard to describe. What makes a piece of music haunting? Would Jackson C. Frank's recordings be as haunting if we didn't know his terrible backstory, or is the extreme melancholy we can feel intrinsic to his music? Would Nick Drake's Pink Moon hit as hard if we didn't know it was a swan song? It's undeniable that something tragic going on behind the scenes is inseparable from the haunting status of a record. But I'd argue that the music itself is already haunting enough. Frank's voice is full of melancholy, and Nick Drake's lyrics would absolutely be brutal even if we didn't know what happened to him. It does make sense, obviously, that a troubled artist might make a haunting work of art. In the case of Cilio, we also have a tragic ending. In 1983, at 33 years old, the Neapolitan composer decided to take his own life. That's a fact that can never be scrapped from his legacy. But I do find it extremely sad when people concentrate on these aspects of an artist's legacy. For me, it always brings to mind the last note that Cesare Pavese, a major Italian writer of the last century, left before he too decided to end things.
Perdono tutti e a tutti chiedo perdono. Va bene? Non fate troppi pettegolezzi.
I think the request should be applied to all similar cases. They're gone. That's it. I think it's important to mention because Cilio's music is very haunting, but it is so his death notwithstanding. It somehow manages to be very sparse, but to have at the same time an incredible amount of pathos and gravitas. It's extremely beautiful, but also disturbing at times. In a word, haunting. You never know where he's gonna go next. From one bar to the following. What kind of melodies are going to enter. When the dissonances are going to resolve themselves, if they ever will. His objective really seems to be
la disgregazione, la svaporizzazione delle armonie.
Take the piece in question, track number 1, Primo quadro. It starts out with this fragile guitar finger picking, which sounds quite beautiful, but he throws in these half tremolos that make it almost sound like it's, glitching out at times. After the first few bars, the piano enters with these tender high notes and everything sounds very pleasant. But you get this feeling of suspension, like something's about to happen. Then the cello enters and you get the real star of the track. It starts bowing these dissonant notes, which will start to really make you uncomfortable. But then it seems to resolve into something more pleasant again for a moment. Something really dreamy that could almost make you think of Debussy. And then the cello starts hitting the lower register. And this is when you really start to feel it. You start getting this unshakable existential dread. And when the voices come in, well, just listen. I don't want to spoil it anymore. The piece is really about the dissonant dialogue between the voices and the cello. When they start bleeding into each other, creating this otherworldly atmosphere, and I don't know how to describe it if not, well, Lovecraftian. It's undeniably alluring, but in the same way that a maddening spiral would be. The highlight of the piece for me is probably when one of the vocal tracks suddenly gets pitched up and cut. It's really the moment that consolidates the unnatural feeling of the whole composition. Then, at the end, you're lulled back to calmness again by the piano, almost as if all the dissonant madness was just a nightmare that is now turning to a nice dream. Cilio's music really sounds alien. There's no other composer like him. It transports you somewhere else, and it makes perfect sense because that's exactly what music is supposed to do, according to him.
La musica, al di là della costruzione di un oggetto sonoro, è in fondo proprio la volontà di materializzazione di un universo alternativo, un habitat altro da sé, dove la coscienza del tempo reale possa essere addirittura nullificata, di essa possa essere operata un'idea di trasmutazione, alterata dalle sue stesse compressioni o dilatazioni.
I'd say he really outdid himself on that one. Now, obviously you should listen to the full album. Trust me, it really is a voyage. But you will immediately notice that the middle tracks are a bit different. The second and fourth tracks are very sparse explorations of dissonance with an almost oriental percussive backdrop, while the third is a piano piece. The last one, Interludio, seems more similar to the opening, at least to me. There's more going on, and we also hear some very nice guitar playing by Cilio himself. I would also absolutely suggest that you listen to Dell'Universo Assente, which is a re-edition of the original with more extra recordings, and I Nastri Ritrovati, literally the rediscovered tapes, which are exactly what they sound like. They are much more sparse and worse in quality, yes, but they really show you how hypnotic Cilio's music was, even with just a single instrument. If you did listen to the piece, I hope you understand why I brought up the music of Erich Zann now. Cilio's compositions are undeniably beautiful, but they also have this almost eldritch quality sometimes. Like if you took Shostakovich's darkest string quartets, gave them Xanax and melted them. Now, some of you cynics out there might go,
This guy never heard a dissonance before.
Shut up, alright? I'm a big boy. I listen to Grimm and only get scared sometimes. The ambiguity of Zann's music is also fitting. It's like Cilio was really summoning something otherworldly and indescribable. But at the same time, it's like his music was keeping something at bay. And in this case, I mainly refer to the elitism of Neapolitan institutions and academias.
Il punto è che Cilio era ormai entrato in contatto con forze istituzionali e accademiche inconciliabili con la sua natura, costipandone la creatività. L'Accademia che forse ha la vera colpa per la morte di Luciano.
And we hear the sentiment from Cilio's own words.
Napoli è una città da troppo tempo pericolosamente abbandonata dalle sue forze migliori. Persone che l'assenza totale di strutture, stimoli, istituzioni e l'arroganza dei loro stessi colleghi hanno costretto a una vera e propria migrazione forzata.
No point in arguing about it now, I suppose. Although it is a cautionary tale for any young and aspiring artists who don't really fit in. You shouldn't be disheartened because the official institutions don't recognize you. They're the lame and ignorant ones. Keep believing in what you do and keep enjoying it. Someone will understand you sooner or later, and if not, fuck them too. So, in conclusion, what else to say if not that I agree with Girolamo de Simone when he writes that Cilio was someone who recognized the stylistic elements of the music of the future, and I'd add of some other universe too. After all of that, Luciano, just like Erich Zann and his music and the Rue d'Oseille, seemed to disappear into nothingness. But not if we have a say.